Hi, everybody. Thomas Beebe here. Welcome to our second webcast in our series on getting started with PHP. For those of you that may have missed the first one, this is focused on Informix. However, it will cover general PHP coding, and so even if some of you are maybe not Informix DBAs or Informix application developers, it should still very much be relevant. Going into just a little bit of about me, I've been doing this for quite a while. If you saw the first one, you've heard this slide before. My name's Tom, work for Advanced DataTools, been active in PHP development for quite a long time now, been active in the Informix community for over 10 years. It is one of my favorite languages to code, PHP that is. And just not get bogged down about me, we're going to get into this. The second part of the webcast, the first one we talked about getting up and running, getting PHP installed, getting the Informix driver, working with it, did a little bit just to make sure we could get connected. If you've not gone through that and watched that webcast yet, and you're looking at doing connections with Informix, I do highly recommend you go view it. I'm also going to be covering it again at the IAUG conference here next week, so if you're listening to this live and you're going to be there, feel free to drop in. This is our second class. We're going to be covering data structures, objects, functions, some basic database access, going into some of the nuts and bolts of PHP, kind of laying the groundwork. The next class, we're going to be actually going into the web programming. Even if you've never done anything writing web pages before, we'll be going into how to do that, doing some simple forms, how you can make them more advanced. And then our final part is going to be in June, and we're actually going to go through and actually put together a full web portal building upon everything else we've covered. Also going to go into a number of other side topics that people have requested. So if there's something you'd like me to specifically cover, drop me an email between now and then. And of course, I'm always available on email if you have questions. Each one is going to be a separate webcast, so please make sure to register for each one. So, going to get going. We're going to talk about writing PHP. We're going to be focusing exclusively on command line scripts. We're not going to deal with any of the web pieces today. We're going to go through data types, classes. We're going to talk a little bit about file access. Going to cover functions. Going to go into some common functions you may be interested in, and then just some other things about the language. This is, we're talking about a full programming language here. This is trying to get some fundamentals there. Hopefully you can take what you learned today, go out, write some basic script, and build off of this. So we're going to start out with one of the core concepts, which is variables. Every variable in PHP starts with a $sign. The naming convention for it is it must start with a letter or an underscore, but then you can contain numbers afterwards. There's no string length requirements, but they are case sensitive. So if you have something that's all in uppercase and something in lowercase for a variable name, they are different. Variable types in PHP do not have to be defined. People that may be more familiar with writing PRC, this may throw them a little bit, or even Java, you do not have to specifically give a type to a variable. The first time it is used or when it is initialized, the PHP compiling system will actually go through, figure out what it is, and allocate the correct amount of memory for it, and will allow you to change on the fly if you need to. Once a variable has been used, it will stay as that data type unless you tell the engine, either you undefine it, you redefine it, or you do something that tells it to change, like you add part of a string to an integer. The engine won't quite know what to do with it. But if it's a new variable, it can be anything you want it to be, or if you redefine it, it can be anything you want it to be. We'll be going through some examples of this shortly. So just a couple of things here, and I'll show that nothing up my sleeve. The first one is just a simple, the variable A is equal to the character A. So the variable B is equal to the string apples. Notice there is no, int a or, char5a or anything else. It is purely a. The first time it is defined and called in the script, it will be automatically set behind the scenes for you. If you want to cast something specifically, there are functions to do so, but by default, you do not have to do so. The third piece here, c equals 5. It sets these, it's a number, there's no quotes around it, so it's going to treat it as a number. And we can then go c is equal to c times 5, so it's going to be 25. And then we take the next one here, which is d is equal to c, and then we concatenate, a period concatenates in PHP with a space, and then concatenate to b. So we're going to actually end up is getting 5 space apples, because c is, actually in this case should be 25 apples. Then we can add 5 to c, using the plus equals. If you're not familiar with it, PHP handles the thing a number of languages do, which you can do the variable plus equals, minus equals, times equals, etc. And it will just take that variable and do the arithmetic directly against it without having to do c equals c plus 5. Just a shortcut. You can also do plus plus just to add 1 or minus minus just to subtract 1. The one neat thing that PHP will do for you if you're working with characters, if you have a character, a variable set to a character, in this case we have, the variable a is set to the character a. If you add 1 or subtract 1, it'll actually treat it as a character. So if you add 1 to the character a, it'll make it b. So this goes off the character code set, so if you start wrapping through, it'll start getting the uppercase characters. I think and then we'll actually go into Unicode, but I have not tested that. A little bit about variable scope. Default variables are treated as local. Some of you that may be coming from Perl or some of the other languages are using more global variables unless defined otherwise. PHP treats everything as local unless said otherwise. If any of you are not familiar with the local versus global, it means that if I define it, a variable in the main body of an application or inside a function, none of the no functions called from that will still know the value of that variable. You have to redefine it or pass it or get it some other way. There's the global keyword. It is actually global. We'll tell that subfunction that these variables are global and will source it in for you. This does give you a full access to modify the values of those variables. So if you change something in it in a subfunction, it will change in the parent. And again, if you need to have actually it's not global in the entire sense. If the function you're calling doesn't know the variable, any children functions on that one won't know it either. We'll get into some examples of all of this in a moment. PHP also has a few built-in variables that can be useful. The first one, and all of these are $, underscore, and then the variable all in uppercase. First one is server. This is really, really useful when doing web development work. We'll be going into this in the next session a fair amount, but it gives you all kinds of information about the server, the browser calling it, what web page is being requested, when it was called, etc. The session variable is specifically for web work. Global is an array of global variables, so if you need to have something that is truly global, you can set it in that global array. Get, post, request, and files, these are all web-based. We will be covering later. The env one is the system environment variables, so if you ever need to get an official list of what is sourced in currently, you can do that. Cookies are managing web cookies. The ones we're going to care about today a little bit are the ARGC, ARGV, which is the arguments passed to a command line-based script. So when you see those, you'll actually know what that is. ARGC is the number of arguments passed, so you can test to make sure you have the correct number. ARGV is an associative array, or sorry, a numeric array of the argument list. ARGV0 is always the script name, so ARGV and the index of 1 will always be the first argument passed. Comments, please use them. There are 3 ways to do comments in PHP. The first one is // the second one is the #. Both of those will treat the rest of that line until a new line as a comment. The third one is ** and then */. Everything between those 2 lines is treated as a comment, so you can do a block comment to give more information. PHP is a fairly unstructured language compared to something like Python or Java that is very, very consistent in how it's written. PHP can be written in a number of different ways. Comments are really useful both for your own reference and for reference of anyone else who's going to support your application. I mean, any good development really should have comments included in there explaining what they're doing. PHP, because there's usually 4 or 5 different ways to do any task, you really want to have comments to explain why you chose the way you did and to explain what you're doing. Most of my samples, you will see comments trying to explain why I did what I did and to make it easier to follow along. For those of you that did not follow the first class or did not actually go and look at it after the fact, all of the samples I will show in this, I do include a TARP or a zip file that'll include all of them, so you can go in and play with them later on, so you don't have to really have to copy down everything I'm posting. One other note, just because I forgot to mention at the top, we are recording this webcast, so if there are pieces you miss or you get a phone call, what have you, you'll be able to go to our website in a couple of days and go and download it to rewatch it. So if you miss writing a note or you want to take all those later, by all means. So I'm going to hop out of this for a moment and share application to do command line. These are the scripts we're going to be playing with today. So this is just some example code that I put together to show a few different pieces. The first one we're going to look at is the variables.php. This is just giving you some different ideas, nothing on my sleeve kind of code with what you see in PowerPoint, but just some different types of setting different variables, different strings, to show some different ways. I'm using the echo command here to output the screen. One note here, I use double quotes around a /n. Just in case anyone's not familiar with that, a double quoted string means it will interpret everything inside. And in this case, /n is a new line. So anytime you see a /n, it means it's going to do a new line when returning back to the command line. So what we're actually going to do here is we set X is 1, string A is test string, and then we actually go through and do some changes to it. We'll actually append the value of X to the string, or to string B, so you actually see what that looks like. I'm actually going to break this into a few different parts. Yeah, this is just different ways to actually set up strings and set up variables. You'll note here that, again, between strings, characters, and integers, there's no differentiation with how I'm defining them. The code, it's purely, if it's a string, it's wrapped in quotes. If it's a number, it's not. And they can be mixed for things like, appending a number to a string. It's fine. It'll know what to do with that. It'll automatically pass that number as a string for purposes of appending it to the string, such as in the case with string B, use string A, concatenate with the value of X. Then we have the X++ example, and then the incrementing Y as a character example. So I'm going to run this. To run a command line PHP script, you can embed the interpreter into the first line if you're on Unix. Most of the time, most people just call the PHP command line binary, and so you just run it that way. I'm going to pipe it to more. So you see here where X is set to 1, and just showing what the X looks like. String B, test string, and then appends the value of X, which is 1. And then we just have X plus 1, or X++ turns X into 2. Y starts out as A, Y++, Y is now B. There are lots of ways you can play around with this. I just want a really simple script out there for if you want to take this at home, play around with it, see how the different variables work. It's pretty straightforward. So again, a lot of what I'm going through today is fairly quick, high-level views of, there we go, high-level views of a lot of different parts of PHP. The goal is not for you to know in depth every little piece. That takes far longer than this webcast series has. But what it is to get you an idea of how the systems work, how pieces work together, and hopefully get you actually started writing code in PHP and maybe kind of excited about it. And then you go in and then learn all the deeper secrets and all the little pieces and extras and everything else that makes PHP what it is. So the next thing is for comparisons. You're doing your if statements, you're doing any kind of other, comparing one thing to another. One of the biggest things that throws people off is equals equals. You're used to, from most languages, that means argument A and argument B are exactly the same. In PHP, it's a little different. This can come back to bite you if you're not careful. An equal is a close equal. It's not exact. It treats null, false, a blank string, or 0 all as the same. So you can say is equal to something, 0 is equal to something that is not set or is, treated as false, and it will return a true. Just be aware of that. Equals, if you do 3 of them, that is the literal equal. So that means that, a empty string and 0 will not return true, they will return false. And the exclamation equals is the not equals for PHP. So anywhere that you have an exclamation is part of a if statement or comparison, that's going to be the negative. Just a structure of a simple script. We talked last week, but you start everything with less than $PHP. You do some code, and I just realized I left off a semicolon on the second line. That is my mistake. And you said the first line, x is equal to 3. The second line is x is equal to the value of x, which is 3 times 5. So then you just print it out. You can use print and echo pretty interchangeably when doing simple code. There's a couple extra features if you want to get into advanced stuff, but most of the time echo and print will be interchangeable. So what does a PHP actually do? So you've got your PHP script. You run it with PHP and then whatever the file name is. What does it actually do? What will happen is the PHP binary goes out, loads all of the modules, and reads the PHP INI file to tell it how to actually function, how much memory is available, what directories it should be looking in for pieces. So it does all these pre-runtime checks and loads all of that into memory. It'll then go and read your entire script, top to bottom. The first thing it does is it scans it for any syntax errors. So if you have anything where you have a missed semicolon, like I did there, or a missed, quote, or any number of, possible syntax errors, it'll tell you. The next thing it does is it runs through the file and loads any classes or functions that you have defined in that file. So it doesn't matter if you have the functions at the top or at the bottom or however you want to lay them out in the file, it'll read all those through before it starts parsing anything. The next thing it does is it'll start from the top line and start executing. If you have function calls, it'll hop around to the functions. If it's just a top-down script, it'll go top to bottom. And what it will do is anytime that there is an include, either using the include keyword or there's a couple of other options there, it'll go, the moment it hits that line, it'll go at that point, read the included file and source in any functions, classes from that, check for syntax errors, the same process here. So it will actually repeat those first 2 lines here, the scan for syntax errors and look through the file to load any class or functions anytime it sees a include. So that way, you can actually have a script that runs fine until at the very end you have an include, at which point the include file has some syntax errors, at which point that's when it will bail out. So just be aware, unless you have your includes at the top of the script, it may not source them in until after other parts are already running. So functions. Just like most languages, PHP has functions. It has a lot of them. There's over 1,000 built-in functions, and this is a living language. They have, one of the complaints about PHP is there's too much choice. Quite a few of the functions, there are 3, 4, 5 different ways, different functions that'll all do roughly the same thing. What they are trying to do as the language moves forward is to trim that down. They have a fairly large list of what are called depreciated functions, ones that still work but will return a warning because somewhere in the future they will be removed from the language. A really good example is they have a number of different functions that'll let you do basically a find and replace on a string. They have whittled that down to 2 that they're keeping. One's just very straightforward and one does regex replacement. All of the others are now listed as depreciated, so if you have old code, you'll get a whole bunch of warnings back going, this function is depreciated, please look at changing it. So these are changing. Look at the documentation as you're going through, because you may want to make sure you're using the correct function when there are several options. The only part that this is really a problem for is if you're Googling for information. If you're pulling up sites from 2008, 2009 with examples, they may not be using the latest and greatest, and they may have some functions on there that are on the depreciated list. When you run your scripts, it'll tell you really quickly, and it will usually point you in the right direction of where to look. But there are over 1,000 built-in functions, and that's not counting ones that they've already sourced out. These are everything, everything that you may be sourcing in from outside libraries with a lot of other languages. Most of them they already have built into the language, so you don't even have to, worry about bringing in outside libraries or having header files or anything else. You can, of course, create your own to do whatever you need to. The only thing is, if a function name is already used, you will get an error trying to define it. Just like if you tried to define 2 functions by the same name, they do not support overloading. Just like variables, they must start with a letter or underscore, but they can have numbers in the name. They're case sensitive. Parameters and return values do not need to have their data types defined. So just like with variables, you can return an integer, you can return an array, you can return a string. You don't have to define it when you're setting up your function. You just have to make sure you know what you're, expecting back and treat it correctly. But that's just, good coding. So a really simple function here, we call it add 5. So again, it starts with a letter and has a number in it. So we set x as 3. We have x is equal to the function add 5 and the current value of x. So basically passing 3. Which then jumps down to the function, add 5, with passing it we're calling that parameter var. So that parameter var is set to 3 when it's called. So var plus equal 5. So var is now equal to 8. And then all it does is return it. So it's a very simple piece. All it does is takes the variable that's passed, adds 5 to it, and then returns it. And then, so back up in the main body, you see that x is equal to that. So x is equal to the original value of x plus 5. It's simple, it's straightforward. Function writing, if you've worked with another one of the scripting languages like Perl, or you've worked with JavaScript even, it's not that different, especially if you've worked with C. Other than the lack of typecasting, it's not that much different. They are all started with function as opposed to sub or procedure in some other language. They are all called function. And they all have braces around, or start and end braces for them. So arguments, you're actually passing to a function. You can have as many as you want within reason. I'm sure there's some upper bound for memory limitations, but you effectively can have as many as you want to pass. You can define a default for a argument, or for the variable value. So if you do not pass that argument, it will take the default. This is how you handle overloading or multiple ways to call a function depending on the number of arguments passed. So the arguments, by default, an argument passed to a function, what it does is it passes the value. So whatever that variable is set to, it'll pass the value, not the variable itself. So what it does is it makes a local copy in memory of that value to be used locally within that function, and once that function call is done, that value is lost. If you change it, it will not change the variable that you pass to it. The exception to that is if you prepend the variable with the function definition, with an ampersand, it will pass the reference to the variable, so that basically the pointer to the variable, not the value. So when you make a change inside the function, it will change the value of the variable back in the main body of the code. So it's just like it is in other languages, but it's there if you want to use it. Most people that I have seen do tend to use the global option when they need to modify the source variable rather than using the ampersand, but either are valid. So just some more argument or function examples. The first one, the function foo, we're passing a variable and then x equal to 2. So there's a couple ways we can actually call this function. The first one is we pass it apple and 5. So you see it passes out the value of apple because that's what var is set to, and then x is set to 5. So we get the value of apple is 5. The second way is we only pass the first argument. So we're only pass setting var. So the value of apple, and then what it does is it sees that x is equal to 2 up in the argument list in the function call, and so it sets x is equal to 2 as a default. The third option is if we don't set either of them, and what it will do is you'll get an error or a warning. Oops, I had an extra O there. You'll get a warning because you're calling a function and you're missing an argument that does not have a default. So going into functions, another quick example here. I'm jumping back. So I will come back to functions because I embed those into other parts. So that's basically your real basic function calls. You know, the functions I'm talking about them as they're very simple pieces. Of course, in real code, they get very, very complex very quickly, but the overall concept of how to define them and how to call them is pretty straightforward. So jumping around here a little bit just to cover some of the basic data types, we're going to talk about arrays because arrays are very commonly used in PHP. They do not need to be defined by length. The memory will be dynamically allocated for it, so you don't have to worry about figuring out the estimated size for them. There are a number of different types. The first one is you get your numeric index, so x1, x2, x3, x4, etc. The second one is associative, so you know x and then a string. You know, so just note that the string value is case sensitive. The third one is you have your multidimensional. So it's, you know, x, you have multiple levels, x1, 2, x0, 1, just like you do anywhere else with multidimensional arrays. You can also do mixed multidimensionals. You know, x3 apple. You know, so you can have the first level be numeric, the second level be associative. You can have it the other way around, both be associative. However you want to do it. All of these are perfectly valid commands. You can go put them into PHP right now with nothing else there. They will take it. They'll initialize the array for you and set those values. You can get as deep as you need to. I have this example here, x3 apple 2 description is equal to test. That's perfectly valid code. It's not good code. It's valid. That doesn't make it right. One of the complaints about PHP is that people take arrays and make them way more complicated than can really be easily managed, which is very true. We'll cover other ways to handle it if you need multi-level data, but just be aware, while you can do this, unless you really, really need to and can't find another way, I don't recommend getting more than a couple levels deep on any array because it gets very hard to keep track of everything. All you got to do is just when you define or when you first call a variable is just, if you pass it anything in brackets, it'll tell it it's an array, and the PHP engine will know it. You can also use the array function if you want to define an array manually. If you pass it a blank one, it'll just create a blank array, or you can actually pass arguments into the array function, and it will set those automatically to values of the array. You can also have mixed indexes within a single array. Again, this is one of those things that you may have a reason to. Unless you have a very good reason, I don't recommend you do this in production code. It gets very hard to keep track of, but you can. We have both a numeric and an associative array in the same single array object. So in this case, 1 is apple, B is pear. Can do it, probably don't want to. Try to break your data into manageable structures. Don't have just one giant array. I've seen far too many sites that do that, where you have fairly elaborate sets of data, and they'll just have one giant 5 or 6 level array, and then trying to keep track of that and keep it all in memory becomes very problematic. Also, think just because you can track 6 levels in an array doesn't mean that your junior programmer who's going to take over the application after you is going to be able to as well. The next part, actually, I'm going to do the example on arrays because I like that example. So I'm going to go through a number of different array types here. The first part here is setting a blank array. I use the printr function. You'll see me use that a fair amount. What that means is it's actually print recursive, and it will go through a variable and print out every level that it's attached to. The second one here is an associative array. I'm passing it the array function. The first string is the key. You do equals, greater than, and then the value it's set to. Third one is I'm doing a numeric array. One little quick cheat in PHP is if you're doing a numeric array and you do just braces or brackets without a number in them, it'll automatically or auto increment to the next value. Following one here is a multi-dimensional array where we actually have the value local, which has set to an array of its own, owners set to an array, and out-of-towners. Again, these are, I will show how this all looks in just a moment. I wanted to put this into an example, though, to send out with this to make sure everyone actually gets an idea of what this actually looks like in code and can play with it. And then some examples of very bad multi-dimensional arrays that you really don't want to do in production. So the first one, and this is what printr looks like, is it prints out the data type and then the value. So the first one we have a blank, so there's nothing there. The second one here we have the lunch array, so this is a numeric. So you see the first value is 0, the second value is 1. The third one, this is where we set up an associated array. So dairy, the value of dairy is set to milk, the value of baked goods is set to cookies. I know I keep these very simple. People, this is where we auto-incremented. Then we have the multi-dimensional array. This is where printr really comes in handy, where you actually have the master array, and then under that we actually have the master array has 3 associative values, and each one of those is their own array, which is numeric based. Again, hopefully you're not having to deal with too much multi-dimensional arrays. It just gets more trouble than it's worth, but sometimes you do need that functionality. And this is where I said really bad arrays, just because trying to keep track of all of this, both in memory and making sure you're on the right levels of data gets very, very tricky over time. You can see how the data is actually displayed here, where you're dealing with 4 levels of multidimensional. So that's just a little bit about arrays. Just for your reference that they're there, hopefully most of the time that you use an array, it'll just be a simple, single level, a list of rows being returned, for example. The next part is classes. Some of you that may be coming from the Java world or the Python world may go, oh yeah, I know classes. Some of you coming from the C world, on the other hand, especially if you haven't done much with C++, maybe like classes, why do I care about those? They were introduced in PHP 5. There was an older version, PHP 4, but it was not fully baked. A class itself, just for a little background, and Java folks are probably tuning me out at this point, it is a data structure that will contain constants, variables, and functions, all specific to a data object. So if you think of a car as a class, I've got my Ford, my particular car, and the variables on that would be things like the color, the mileage, the gas mileage, the trim level. Each of those would be then attached to my data object, which is the car. Then we'd have functions. The function might be turn on, or turn the blinkers on, or turn the wipers on to fast. Each one of those is a method. It's something that this data object is going to do. And then constants would just be anything that would be for any type of car. Maybe in the auto magazine might be a constant that every single car of our class type would have consistently. But the variables would be unique for each individual object, and the methods would be then called upon that object. But what it's doing is, if you think of it in a data object, a database model, where you have your star schema into a central fact table, the class object is that fact table. It's telling all these different parts into a single entry that then you can look at and then do things with, trying to simplify it all. So rather than updating 10 arrays if the car 10 is needs a change, you're only having to modify the individual data record for that particular car. It makes doing data management with especially larger applications, but anytime really you're dealing with especially complex data, it makes it very, very easy to write reusable code, write clean code, and especially when you're dealing with web work, write code that you separate your display from your logic. Also makes it far easier for somebody coming down to do work on your application in the future not to screw something up. I cannot tell you the number of places I've been to that have 5 or 6 different sections of code to update a record in different parts, written in different ways, that may not work all consistently. This allows you to write code that anytime somebody hits a save from any point in your application, it's all being handled exactly the same way through one function that then if you need to make a change on, that's the only place you need to adjust. They will make your life easier. I do not buy into the, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me on this, the everything to be a class model, but I do think data structures make a lot of sense to me. So, setting up a class, you're creating, I like my example of, we're doing, cars. What functions are we going to need to use? With data management, my standard functions are create new, save, update, and load, and usually delete. Those are kind of my standard ones when I'm hitting it from a database. But of course, depending on what you're trying to do, how you want it to display, you will obviously have different functions depending on your intent. And make sure everything is consistent. It's sort of like building an API, and a lot of times it is the backbone of building an API, which is, a standard set of calls and standard methods to access data. It'll tell it makes it very clean that the data is only handled in a single way, So you don't have to worry about future programmers breaking something by trying to reinvent the wheel or create their own update statements or anything else. It also allows you to do much better error handling than necessarily need to do it by hand each time. Every variable and function, a couple of things about a class in PHP. Every variable and function can be defined as public versus private. By default, they are considered public, so if you don't differentiate, they will be considered public. What it means is a public call you can call from any part of the code. I can say, I may have my, save call that against my record that I want to call from anywhere. But a private call means that it can only be called from another part of the class definition. So if I want pieces that, when you load it up, it sets a variable, let's say the car VIN number, for example. We don't want another part of the application, someone in the future that's modifying it, to do something where they can accidentally change the VIN somewhere else in the code. You want that as a private variable so that our protected variable, I should say protected for that case, but private means you can't call it. Protected means it can't be changed, but the private may be the deletion. You want to have it run through another function first. You don't want it you directly delete. You want it to run through the confirm delete function first. Protected would be you can view it, but you can't edit it. But there's all sorts of different levels. If you're the only person that's ever going to hit the application, you know exactly what you're doing, you don't need to deal with these. But that's fairly rare, and especially in the corporate world. It's rare that you're the only person that's writing it, and it's rare that you're the only person that'll ever be maintaining it. This allows you to control the data that's in the class, telling it what can you manage from the rest of the application, what do we only want to touch and edit from the class. So it just makes life a lot easier, making sure your data is consistent. Why I keep harping on this, and some of you may be glazing over because of it, is PHP has a bit of a reputation for being not well maintainable code and a lot of very bad code, which honestly is true. There's a lot of code that has been written for PHP that is really, really bad. The reason is because it gives you so many different ways to write the code. It means people have decided to write the code every way possible, not just, ways that are clean and easy to maintain. So I'm specifically harping on some areas that will make it easier to write clean code, reusable code, and maintainable code so that, your application will not just be usable, but will be maintainable, which is often overlooked. So a little bit about why you actually want to use the class, just a little bit more. Again, so you standardize your input and output on data and your calls. This is really true with database calls. Single point for all the data classes, so you don't have to worry about rewriting, the same bit of code over and over and over. You can set up proper trapping, make setting up the database logic from the code. You can use the same class on multiple projects if they have similar methods. Do note here, yes, if you're really good writing functions, you can do all of this in functions. It just gets a lot harder when you start dealing with complex data. This is, anytime you're writing a class, this is the important piece. It is a predefined variable inside of the class that will be basically everything of every function, variable, etc. about that particular class object. I'll show some examples in a minute. It's global across the class. You don't have to source it into functions. You can set it to any data type that you can set a PHP variable to. I have a couple examples here. This, var, so we're doing a associative, or actually a multi-dimensional array here. You could also do it with this var as test. We could also do this, this color is red. This model is, fusion. This, whatever, this variable is equal. It is an object unto itself. We'll use this here in an example in just a moment. You can also set up an empty class if you want to set up a class to do some kind of function within an application, but you don't need a full class file for it. You just need some objects. You can set up a new SED class, and that will actually set up an empty class for you to use. I just mentioned it so it's there in the back of your mind, and especially if you go back and rewatch this later on. Classes can also be extended, so if you've written a class, it works great, but you need to add a couple of new functions and you don't want to touch the source files. You can extend the class through a separate class call to allow you to add more functions or functionality to it. So you can get fairly complicated, but the big place where I see this useful is if you're working on an existing product, especially if it's a commercial product or something that's fairly established, like let's say WordPress or Drupal or something like that. You don't want to go messing with the core code because especially it'll break the next upgrade cycle. You want to just add some extensions to existing classes to add in the functionality you need without touching the core code. Couple of special functions unto classes. Construct, this is a really big one. This used to actually be the name of the class. This has been changed. It is now the underscore, that is 2 underscores. Construct class or function inside a class. What happens is when the object is created, when you actually first call that class, that function will be executed. So things that you want to initialize, whether it's you want to load the value of the variable or you want to set up some base variables inside of the class, the construct function is your go-to. Destruct is the exact opposite. When that class is unset or otherwise unloaded from memory, and this does include the end of the application, the destruct function will be called. So if you need some kind of cleanup, you want to have some kind of update function, that'll be called at the end. So if you want to use, if you like Java and you like the method of it just automatically sourcing in class files by name, there is the SPL autoload register function you can use, and you can set that up inside of PHP to look in the include directory and load a class by the defined class name when it's called. I just know some of the Java folks use that. A lot of the folks coming from the C world tend to avoid that. The self-titled function, this is the old way of doing it. Just call it the underscore construct method now, but it works the same way, where when the argument is passed or when the class is created, it'll call that function with any arguments it's passing. Down here at the bottom, I have a good example of how to create a class object, which is you say, variable is equal to new and then class name. And then you can pass a variable if you want to, if your construct function is expecting an argument. So I'm going to do some examples of classes here. Again, I'm doing some high-level views of a lot of this. I'm really hoping if some of you are energetic about PHP and like, this looks kind of cool, that you'll take some of these classes, some of these sample files, some of these classes, et cetera, and play with them. Play around with them. Watching these webcasts are great. Nothing is going to, give you the same as taking it and writing your own code. So I highly, highly recommend in everyone's copious spare time, if you're really interested, go in and play with some of this code, play with some of this stuff, create some classes, create some variables, see what it's like. So I have a couple examples here. The first one is my new test class. And what I have here is the first line of code is var is set to new test class and pass it the value of 4. So what it will do is, remember, it reads top to bottom, loads classes and functions first. So when we first call it, it's going to load in, see, okay, we have the class of test class. It loads that into memory as an available class. And then we'll start reading from the top and go, oh, okay, we want a new test class. So it will go in, create a new object of the class test class. And what it will actually do is call it the self-titled function. Again, this is being replaced with construct. I just found out that they're depreciating self-titled, but it hasn't happened yet. So I'm telling everyone to move over to __ construct. And we're setting x is equal to 5 as a default. So what will happen here is it's going to create the new test class. If you pass it just called new test class with no arguments, it'll set x to 5. Otherwise, in our case, we're giving it to 4. So it's going to set x to 4. And what it's going to do here in this function, so the first thing it calls is the function test class, is if x is equal to 5, we're going to call get default. This little bit of code here, test class : get default. Every function call inside of a class needs to have the class name : function name. That way it knows it is a class-specific function, not one of the functions in the larger PHP code. So it's going to call the get default function. Otherwise, we're going to call the get value function and pass along that value, which in this case is 4. So it's going to jump down in logic, and we have private functions because they're not being directly called. They're being called from inside the test class. So we could not directly call get value, but we can call the test class function, which will inside of it call the get value function. And it's going to set the value, notice we're using this variable, and it's going to set the value of name on this to define value class. That's what it's going to call it. It's going to set it to a string, and that's what it's going to set it to. And then we're going to set this val, so the variable is val, and it's part of the this object, and it's going to be set to the value of x. Otherwise, if it was set to 5, it'd be set over here and they get default to 5. So this is how we do basically a default function in a class. So what it's done up here, again, to run through the logic, it's going to create a new object of the test class and set it to the variable var. It's going to pass it 4, which is going to tell it to go down to the get value function and set var and then the value to 4. And if I have a couple more examples of this, so if you're not following me, don't worry. I'm going to change the names before the next time I present this. So it's going to tell me the starting value, and then it's going to add more, and then give me the ending value. So when I actually run this, and I think I will I see the starting value is 5. We added 5 more. So it then changes the ending value to 10 because it takes that value, adds 5 to it, and then gives us the defined value class because that's just printing out the value of the object and then the attribute of that object of name. So that's a semi-simple class. Does a couple of things, nothing really real world. So I wanted to do, when talking through this class with some other people, wanted some real world examples. So I decided to do that. So I created a class called memory class. Apologize, I do have this wrapping a little bit. One advantage, by the way, of PHP is you can it'll take everything inside of quotes as a string, so you can just add new lines. It's not going to break anything. I changed my resolution size, so this is wrapping where it wasn't before. So it assumes until there's a semicolon, it's still part of the same command. But what I have done here is I created a table on my database. It is in Stores Demo called memUsed. I intentionally create at the creation script up here, so if you want to try this at home, you absolutely can. So I create a class of memory. I have my construct function, so this will be called when the data object is created, and I pass it the serial ID as a default. So if the serial ID is set to the default value, it creates a new memory entry. Otherwise, it's going to load it based on the ID. So the new memory entry, I just set a couple of default values, and it goes on its way. The load memory entry, what I do is I source in my database handle, the DBH variable, and then I will explain the try-catch piece in a moment, but I wanted to show this class first. And what I do is I create a SQL statement here and store it to a variable. Remember last class where I was talking about how to do basic database calls? This is a fairly basic one. So I create my statement. I create a statement handle by preparing that statement. I execute that statement, passing it the serial ID. I then fetch the values of that row return, because it's only going to be returning a single row. And then I do a for each loop I will explain in a moment, setting this and then the variable, which would be the column name, to the value. So every of that, it will return a single row, and for every column in that row, it will set the value of this data object to that column name as an attribute, and set the value of that attribute of the value of the data in the database. So I will come back to the try-catch here in a moment. I also have a save function here, which all I do is all I have is a simple insert statement. I prepare it, and then I create a variable, or I create an array called values, and this is of all the values I'm going to pass it. And then all I do is execute, and then I just run a dbinfo, sqlca, sqlerrb1, which for those of you that aren't Informix people, this is how Informix you get the most recent inserted serial ID. So then it's going to return that and set the value of serial ID to the inserted value. So what this function does, it goes in, takes your current data object, stores it in the database, and then sets that data object's serial ID attribute to the attribute, or to the ID that we just inserted. So if it's serial ID 10, this serial ID will be equal to 10 once it inserts. So that's all this does. But I'll tell you why I just went through this. I have this code. It looks a little, jumbled around. Is because then I can write something like this. Got a little bit of code here. Again, I put my creation script here just so it's handy. I include my db.php. Remember, this is a script we made last week to actually connect to our Informix database. I'm using the stores demo database for this, just for reference. I then include my memory class PHP file, so it'll source in that before it does anything else. And in this point, I create a new object of type memory, and we're storing it to the memory variable. So it's create a new object. All it does is set those defaults to it. And then I'm going to run the command free. For those of you that are not Linux admins, the command free shows you the amount of memory you're currently using and how much is free. This is what I include the output. Notice this is within the comment bracket of what this looks like. And then what we're going to do is run the command shell exec, which does, every language has this some way or other. A lot of them use backticks, which actually can in PHP as well. But this runs the command and will return the value of that command, everything that's displayed out normally to the screen, to a variable. So in this case, we're running free, grepping it just for the mem line. So just purely for this line here, the mem line, and returning it to the output variable. We're going to use a function called preg_split, which is a regex split. If any of you worked with Perl, this probably looks pretty familiar. And what we're basically doing is taking this line here, the one that says mem, colon, everything else, and we're going to create an array on it, breaking it out by anything that's one or more spaces. So the first one is going to be mem, then the second array object is, or the second array value is going to be the total, third is going to be the used amount, etc. So once we run the preg split on that output, this is what we return. So we create an array in memory. Those are our values. So you see where it splits everything out, each one of the different fields into a different array value. We're going to then go through and set each of the memory attributes, memory variables, to that part of the array. So, the total is going to be the memory array index 1. The used is going to be memory array index 2, etc. So now we have the memory object, and I just did a print R of what it looks like right now. That's what it currently looks like in memory. The serial ID is still set to the default of -1, but the total, used, free, shared, buffered, and cached are now all set to what we had from the output from that command. And then all we have to do is memory save. One line, single line. That's all we have to do. And saving it to the database. And then setting the serial ID out. And then all we do is a quick output of what it looks like. So again, nothing up my sleeve. Check memory, and this is what the output gives me. The serial ID 6, total, used. And to show you what it looks like from the command itself, this is what it looks like. You notice that I used a tiny bit more memory because I ran it again, but it is the same command, same data. So I could have this script, this PHP script, run every minute on my server, let's say. And it will tell me exactly what is the current memory usage on that system. You could have a cron job. You can have it through any scheduler you're currently using. You could have the Informix scheduler, if you want to call it. And it will go through and now log into your Informix database your current memory situation on that box. This is the sort of thing that PHP lets you do. And it's not that you can't do this in Perl or Python or anything else. You absolutely can. But it is easy to do. And you notice how the class, really the only parts of this application here that aren't comments are I create the object in one line. I take 6 lines to set the attributes, which I could probably do even faster with a for loop, and then 1 line to save. 8 lines of code. That's it. And really, I could get it down to about 4. And it saves it out into the database. I've now saved it. And then what I can do is use that class again. I've got another script called load memory. All this one does, I include the database connection, the memory class. I pass the first argument as the ID. It loads it in. It creates a new memory object and passes that ID in. So what it's going to do is, remember on the default, because we're hitting the default, the construct function, with the memory ID set, so rather than setting a default, it's going to load it, run that load function. And then all we do is print out the value. So if I want to do load memory, the last one we put in was 6, we can pull it back out. Note it includes the date stamp, just a date time year to second with current year to second as the default. So it automatically timestamps it for you. So we could then go in and use the same code. Where PHP becomes really useful, though, is, okay, we've got this in here. It's, we're running it on the server. Great, I could do this in Perl. I could do this in C. I could do this in whatever language I want to. Well, I can use that same class file, the same database connection file, and have a web-based system. I could tie it into OAT. I can do all these other things with it through these really nice functionalities through the same code base, through the same files. You don't have to have, one set of files for your web-based stuff, another set for your, your script on the back end, and a third for, some unload process. You can have everything through the same class files, through the same shared functions. That's where it really excels. So, getting into it just a little bit more here. We are going to run a little bit over, but I was intending on that anyway. I apologize for to hit Shift F5 there. So, loops, real simple. And most languages have this. You have your standard for loop. This is C101, where you have variable and its starting amount. The second part is the conditional statement where it's still valid, and third one is the increment. The while loop is while variable is less than variable or greater than what have you. Do something. The third one, though, this is the one that's fairly neat, is the for each loop. A lot of languages have them. Every language I seem to work with does it a little differently. In PHP, what it does is you pass it a for each, and then you pass it an array or a object, either one. And what you can do is you give it a info as, and you give it key is equal to var. You can name your variables however you want to for key and var, and it'll tell it the key. It'll set the it'll output or loop through each value in there, and will actually give you the key value pair for each one set to those two arguments. So you could take your particular row from the database, you bring it in as an associated array or an object, run through each value in it, and tell that value, basically loop through and do something with each key value pair, which would be column name and value of that row. You can also do it if you are using a numerical array. You can just say info as var, and it will just give you the values, or the values of the objects, and we'll just ignore the keys. So a little bit about error handling. Try-catch was introduced in PHP 5. I touched on this last class. I do want to highlight it. How it works is you do a try, and then you use command try, and then in braces you give it whatever code you want it to run, and then you follow the end with catch, and then exception, and then your exception variable, and then a second block of code. And what will happen is it'll run through everything in the try block unless if it hits an exception or an error, it'll fail right there, and then run whatever is in the catch block. So you could use, where I use this heavily is I will do at the beginning of the try block, do a begin work. At the end of the try block, do a commit, and in the catch block, do a rollback. So it'll start doing all the work, doing all the SQL statements. If one of them fails for whatever reason, whether it's a lock problem, whether it's a constraint issue, whether I've got a SQL error, it'll fail, jump down to the catch section, drop me an email or whatever I want to do in the catch to log out an error, and then call a rollback. So it'll automatically roll back the error. And what it will do there is I could tell it to die or exit in the catch if I just want the application to fail if something goes wrong. On the other hand, I may not want it to fail if something goes wrong. I may want it to cleanly keep on moving, keep on with life, or I may want it to, redirect them back to the index page. Something's failed, I want them to go back to the main page, try it again. I can do that there. It doesn't have to immediately fail and exit out or get a segment error or whatever on an error. What you can do is you can cleanly trap and handle those errors instead. So you can also then use the variable E. There's all kinds of documentation on this to actually then diagnose the problem. I will normally, what I do with a lot of my code is add in a debug function that I put in every catch statement that if there's an error that occurs that we're not expecting, it logs out everything in the session variables, everything in the from the E variable. So then I can go back and do basically do a stack trace or a debug process against what everything was that was currently being processed, where it's being processed, everything else. And a lot of times I can make very nice error messages for the user to see, so they aren't seeing just, an Informix error SQL. What you see is, sorry, something went wrong with the database. Please try again, 5 minutes, or contact support. However you want to handle it with. But it's a very nice bit of code. I highly recommend you get in the habit of writing it, just because you never know when an error might happen that you're not expecting, where you just think it couldn't. A couple of common functions I wanted to touch on. As I said, there are over 1,000 functions available just in the stock PHP system. But a couple that get used a lot, or at least might be of interest to folks on this call, the fopen, fread, fgets, fwrite, fputs, the full F, what have you, file-based functions work very similar to their C counterparts. They're all in there, read up for context. Substring, string length, trim, these are standard string functions. This is what they're called. Every language seems to name them a little differently. The next one is explode and preg split. Explode is based on a Perl function, or I think the naming came from it. Preg split is the regex version of this, where what it does, is, like we saw in the example, you give it a string and it will split out the string by whatever variable or whatever substring you give it, and then turn each other iteration. So you can break out a time, you just pass along the colon, for example, and it will return the hour, minute, second as an array. The next one is string function, string replace, preg match. Anything that's preg means it's a regex. If it's just string, it's generally just a straight string and it's not going to handle a regex correctly, but it does. These are find and replace, and match will actually do a regex match system. Printr, we've gone over. It'll do a recursive print. It's great. For Perl folks, this is the same as or similar to data dumper. There's a built-in mail function. Read up on it if you want to use it. If you just do it with a to and a body and a message body, you'll probably get blocked by a lot of spam filters I found. But there's some really good rules posted out there for how to cleanly format it to make it a proper email. But it's there. It's built in on. I should exclaim, it does expect to be able to use SendMail, or which also will include Postfix, Axum, most of the standard Unix-based mailers. On Windows, you do actually, in the PHP INI file, need to define an outgoing mail server if there's not one in the box. The last one I want to mention is die, and I should have included exit in there too. If you've worked with other applications before, this does exactly what you think it does. It kills the application at that point, and the argument is a message to be printed out. It's useful if you want to die on an error, or you want to cleanly handle if they don't pass enough arguments. I just want to mention it's there. So a little bit, some links. These are the same as the last one, just information about it. One thing I will highly stress here, though, especially if you want to go and play with some of this code yourself, if there are functions you're not sure about or you need more information on, just go to php.net/function name. What it'll do is that their documentation is fantastic. If you do that, you php.net/ then the function name, you will actually get directly to the page on what the function does, what all the syntax is, the arguments, return values, all of that very nicely laid out. It will also, if you read down, there's a very, very, honestly, the best I've found online, wiki of examples and cases where people have used the function and different ways that it has been useful for them. So a lot of times you can find what you're trying to do there in some fashion in what they have posted below if the initial description does not give it to you. It really is one of the best documentation resources I've found. If you're programming on the go, so if your flight's coming up, you can actually go into the documentation section and actually download the whole thing as one big set of HTML files. They do a very nice job with the documentation part. I'm going to do a couple more slides here. I want to show a couple more examples, and then we'll open up for questions. IEG 2014 is next week. For those of you that are going, or if you're still not sure, please come. It is a fantastic event. If you are going, just letting you know, I am doing several classes, one of which is I will be going over a slightly more advanced version of the Getting Started with PHP and Informix class that we did last month. I also, on Thursday morning, have a tutorial on it'll be some rehashing from this week, but then also going then into actually web application development as a tutorial on Thursday. So it's Thursday morning. If you can make it, would love to see some of you out there for it. Just a little bit about us. We do consulting, support, we do remote DBA. We have more webcasts out, and we're going to be coming out with more. Check us out. Also, and I think this is the first time this is officially being announced, we're going to be running the next fastest Informix DBA contest in 2014, or excuse me, the first one in 2014, but the next one's going to be starting in July. This one is going to be specifically on SQL performance tuning. We're going to have the webcast kick off on June 24th, so we'll have more information up on the website soon. So I just want to show a couple other samples here really quickly. First one is the equals. This is just a real quick example of what the different equals actually look like. Notice how I set A is to a blank string, B is set to 0, and C is not set. So what you'll actually see here is going through. This is just a little handy guide. I actually use this occasionally when showing people how to look at comparisons. A is equal to B, but not equal to B. You get an undefined variable C if you try to compare to it. A is equal to C because if you do equals to an undefined variable, it's considered undefined, which on a close match is considered. A is empty because it is no string length, but it does exist. C, on the other hand, does not exist. If you look at this last line here, if is set, what you actually have with the is set function is the variable actually defined already. Depending if you have notices turned on for the error logging, you'll get notices if you try to compare to or access an undefined variable. So you'll get a notice about it like you do here. If you have notices turned off, it'll just treat it as a null. So just mentioning that equals is there. Again, just a refresher on the DB script. All we have here is I actually put environment, use the put environment command to set Informix third, just to make third set, pass the username, password, etc. And then I actually create my new database handle here. I'm creating a new class of the type PDO. This is what the PDO driver does. And then I pass it the argument, actually it's 3 arguments. The first one is one long string. You notice the quotes here. This defines how to actually do the connection. And then the second and third arguments are the username and password. And then I set 2 elements on that class of the database handle for the error mode and setting it to lowercase. So that's all we're doing here. So if you saw those last week or last class and you're like, okay, what, I don't quite get why it's doing it, it's because PDO is a class object. So when you create the database handle, you're creating a variable set to a class data type of PDO. So all the attributes, all the methods on that PDO are actually a class unto itself. I mean, if you wanted to go dig into the code of it, that's exactly what you would say. So I just wanted to bring that up as an example. So when you're looking at this code, you're like, okay, that's what that is doing. That's what I'd like everybody to get out of this class. So it keeps jumping back at me. So with that, I am going to leave it here. Put it up for any questions on the webcast. Send me a message if you would like me to answer a question. Also, I am certainly available via email if you have any questions as follow-up to this. Please let me know if you do. I'll also be available at the conference. So let me go to questions here. So send me a, there's the chat comments. Go to the, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and go to the chat comments, the chat box, and feel free to put in the question either as global or directly to me, and I'll be happy to answer if you have any. Or again, I'm happy to take them over email if you want to get me later on them. So I'm waiting for folks to type it up. What we're going to cover next class is going to be actually doing all the web pieces. So we're going to go into how the web pieces work with PHP. We're going to be using Apache, but it will certainly be applicable to any web server. And then how to actually do the forms, how to then tie it all back into the underlying database code. Okay, first question is can an index array be a negative integer? They can absolutely be. 0 is a completely valid, and it is the default first value for an array. So arrays do start at 0, but you can manually set it to a negative. So are there any other questions? Okay, great. If anyone has any other question, I'm going to talk for a minute more. We'll be putting up a recording of this in the next couple of days on the website. So if there are parts you missed or parts you want to go look over again, or if you want to pass this along to anyone, feel free. It'll be up in a couple of days. We'll also be putting up a copy of the slide deck and a copy of all of the sample files. So do feel free to play around with them. And if you have anything that you have questions about, having trouble with, what have you, please feel free to email me. I love talking about this stuff. Or just if you're at the conference, feel free to hit me up with it. So thank you all very, very much for being on here. And hopefully I will see all of you on the next webcast.